ladies and gentlemen. Our first speaker is my colleague, Fiona Ramsey, who's just been promoted to senior lecturer in the Department of Theatre Performance. She's the HOD of the same department in the Wits School of Arts. And the research has at its core her practice of over 30 years as an actress and vocal coach. And her MA was based on a case study on accent acquisition, and a PhD investigates cultural appropriateness and all appropriation in theatre and how this may impact on a pedagogy for acting. The title of her presentation is Reflections and Reformative Reconstruction. Fiona, my dear colleague, the time is yours, and I'll start the timing. And if you can also time yourself over that side, so we can finish within the allocated time frame. Thank you, Fiona. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to make sure that it was me who was going to present, because I was told Hafela needed to go before me. Has that changed? It's all right. Okay, great. Well, here goes. So good afternoon, everybody. Although I've performed many roles in many theatres around the world, this is one of my first academic presentations and fairly daunting. And although I toyed with the idea of using visual aids, I concluded that I'm interrogating performance, so it's just going to be me. My research is called Reflections and Reformative Reconstruction. And I ask what the implications are for teaching acting technique and skills if practices and content fall outside a cultural range that an actor might be asked to inhabit. I revisit the embodied knowledge of my archival work to examine the process of creating a character with regard to methodology, cultural context, cultural appropriateness, and cultural appropriation, and interrogate the implications that emerge for the pedagogy of performance. This question is posed in the context of contemporary protest around a range of issues that share relationships with theories of identity and mono/multicultural debate. The idea of stepping out of one's own cultural framework and inhabiting or attempting to inhabit one that is other has been described as a form of colonization. However, this premise is one of the fundamental principles of the craft of acting. And culture is central to what we see, how we make sense of the world and how we express ourselves. So how does or should a performer research and embrace the cultural complexity of a character? By investigating—
Your camera's off. Is that deliberate?
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. Oh, how silly. I'm so sorry. Wasn't deliberate at all. How silly. Oh. Here I am, acting away. Here we go. So sorry, so I'll pick up where I left off. Let me just find my place. So sorry about that. Hello, everybody. Okay, so to continue, how does or should a performer research and embrace the cultural complexity of a character? By investigating the performer's process, revisiting the role and adapting the approach to become inclusive and multicultural, perhaps the craft of acting needs to shift, not only in the approach to how the role is performed, but how one's teaching methods and content may need to change. So traditional, could I ask people to turn their mics on to mute, because I am hearing some interference. Traditional criteria demonstrating the craft or skill of performance are often located in the performer's ability to inhabit or bring to life a character, being able to sublimate one's own personal specific habits and more general cultural habits or custom of expression. And in many, but not all theories or methodologies, it's considered the pinnacle of acting prowess, where the actor assumes the identity of a character so completely and convincingly that one forgets who the actor is. Do artists from a different culture have the right to portray, paint, dance, or pen the stories of other cultures? And who owns culture? Can I engage in a shared culture? And as South Africans fall into a group comprising a multiplicity of language, ethnic, and racial backgrounds, can we share a culture? The study will reflect on works in the collated archive of my professional work, investigating approach to roles outside my immediate cultural framework, and specifically how this manifests in portraying these identities. In compiling the archive of my performed, written, and creative work from 1979 to 2019, spanning 40 years, I will visit 3 works, reflect on them, and reconstruct to address the primary question of my research. I'm going to attempt to engage in multimodal research models suggested by Carey Jewett, aiming to incorporate both language-based and nonverbal aspects of performance resources and examine how these function together to make meaning. Although language is key, I will consider the semiotic potential of gesture, image, sound, visual aspects, and others of performance. I am very aware and I acknowledge the difficulties that arise from investigating my own work. And the question Ricoeur posed as to what extent it is possible for an artist to speak about their own work with any authority. And he concluded it was impossible for the artist to acquire sufficient distance from their work. But I will address the observer and the observed performance, because performance relies on the interaction between the observer and is based on being another and being for another. And therefore, any assessment of whether a former or present audience of a role is culturally appropriate or appropriation is being practiced is in the domain of the receiver. But I hope to address some of these issues by examining my practice in relation to acting methodologies, and mostly importantly, the intellectual rigor an actor engages in when creating a role in terms of the research, the many choices that offer themselves, the process of distillation of these options, and to arrive at this individual choice. South African-born Professor Emeritus at Edinburgh University, Dennis Walder, said, "The imaginative reconstruction of the past may be a conservative and parochial activity, but equally it may be radical and disturbing activity, reflecting a challenging sense of inadequacy, recalled or reclaimed images of earlier times and places." And that is at the core of my research. The research embraces 2 strands of inquiry, investigating the acting methodologies and the craft of playing characters outside my own cultural framework, how my embodied knowledge has informed my teaching methodology of voice and character in performance, and to reflect on how this might need to shift. A primary purpose of theatre pedagogy is to bring change in understanding the world, and skills are taught to empower the performer to do so. A core technique I teach is how to inhabit, inform, and become a character, and relies on the performer's ability to shed as much of their own identity as possible and take on that of the character. This involves tools and techniques to facilitate transformation of voice, gesture, etc. And as such, I suppose would sit in a hybrid form of illusionist and traditional acting methods, because of course a performer is not inhabiting or transforming into a real person, but a representation of a character, as the character already exists in a text and is already a fiction. A core focus is the function of the voice in playing a role outside one's culture and interrogating its ability to serve as a primary signifier. As my methodology is situated in the voice of self, shifting to the voice of the neutral self, and finally moving to the voice of the inhabiting self, which is the character. My creative research will take the form of a lecture performance, which due to the pandemic will be filmed and submitted along with the essay as part of the thesis. The creative research will be a reformed reconstruction of selected excerpts, which we compared to the original versions. I have filmed versions of previous performances will be submitted as a form of assessing the methodologies, the approaches, and their cultural responsibility. Diane Taylor's view of performance is that it is an episteme, or a way of knowing, and not simply an object of analysis, and resonates deeply with my experience of performance as my learnt, accumulated, and assimilated reservoir of embodied knowledge, which I communicate in many praxes and forms. Culture is that it holds meaning and significance across many modes, where language is not only a system of communication, but an indication of culture and a particular culture. And accent and dialect can act as defining indications of culture in performance and contribute to a wider framework and context to elicit personal and social identities of nationality, gender, class, and ethnicity. The data for the study will be derived from primary sources of the productions that include scripts, film performances, reviews in newspapers, peer review, journal experiences of rehearsals, overview of current themes prevalent at the time, and how these serve to reflect the socio-political embracing cultural policy and the political framework in which each work was created, and how that speaks to now. My first role is Born in the RSA, written by Barney Simon and the cast, in which I play the role of the human rights lawyer Mia Steinman, as one of 7 characters in the play linked by the affiliation to the fight against apartheid oppression and social injustice. The work was created in 1985 in response to the draconian state of emergency declared, allowing the apartheid government to detain people in large numbers while bypassing legal avenues. A further state of emergency was declared in 1986 when the play was performed, and children and students were again at the center of the demonstrations and detentions. Mia is a fusion of consolidation of research and interviews with lawyers practicing in South Africa in 1984 and 85, and the distillation of their identity into a white lawyer in the political landscape of apartheid South Africa. I will examine only the text of Mia's account. Barney Simon's work was fostered by his religion of humanity and ideological conviction, and central to this play is the issue of betrayal. I go now and give you a taste of Mia's voice. Okay, my name is Mia Steinman. I'm an attorney. Both my parents were Afrikaans, and my father, Paul Leroux, was a very active political lawyer and a colleague of Bram Fischer. So anyway, I'm a lawyer. I was born to a lawyer. I'm married to a lawyer. My husband, Mike Steinman, was killed in a motor accident 3 years ago, so I run his practice now. Look, I don't have kids. I've always wanted kids. But, well, at first Mike wouldn't, and then I couldn't. And in some ways, no, actually in many ways, I'm sorry, but my life is extraordinary. I wouldn't want it to be different. I want my world to be different, but not me. So I'm 5'5", I'm a heavy smoker. I just haven't had time to stop. You know, I haven't had a steady lover now for 2 years, but I haven't had time to look. But I feel privileged to be part of a community that is mine. Some are clients and a lot of potential clients, but we all have one basic thing in common, a desperate need to change the world we live in. So the second character is from a play I wrote with Megan Wilson called If We Dig. It was born by chance from another project in 2016. And during the research period of the work of social historian Luli Kalinikos, who was used as a primary resource, to get a real sense of the issues we were tackling, we set up to interview Luli. And it was during this that Megan and I became aware that Luli was in fact our play. Kalinikos's work traced the history of South Africa and particularly Johannesburg, and at the core is migrant peoples. The play is a dramatic distillation of Kalinikos's trilogy of the social history of Johannesburg, drawn from interviews of people and investigation into their lives, living conditions, opportunities. She herself was an activist and of Greek heritage, and her study interrogates the significance of migrant and immigrant populations in influencing culture and cultures. The work aimed to give voice to the voiceless. And apart from playing Cleo, based on Luli, I also play real characters from Johannesburg's past, the people working in mines, mills, factories on the ground, who despite the bigotry, the racism, the classism and fear that fed apartheid, did see each other as equals. I play an Afrikaans garment worker, an Indian activist, a young girl living in Joburg before the Group Areas Act, a colored woman from Cape Town, but I did not play any of the many Black characters from the trilogy. Because any claim by a white person to be able to inhabit the identity of a Black person is extremely offensive, and doing so could never claim actually to transform into a Black person. But theatre does not do this. It works with external markers of identity and culture, and perhaps language above all, to create this believable illusion. In the reconstructed excerpts from If We Dig, I'm going to attempt to play one of the Black characters abandoned in the first version as part of the inquiry. And I'm aware that I would need to address the implications of blackface. Here is Cleo from If We Dig. You know, my life is very ordinary, really, nothing exceptional. I think about the people I have met and interviewed, and you know, I just can't see how I could be more interesting than them. In this book, I give a sort of, well, it's life stories of, I think it's 5 people. And this is, you know, leading up to apartheid. There are so many stories that never even made the final edit, you know. This book, I think, is out of print. You know, this is my last copy. I don't know what happened to the others. I did have 3 or 4. But, you know, people, some of the nicest people forget to return your books. I mean, they sincerely plan to do it, but it doesn't happen unless I get in touch with them. Anyway, I follow people's stories and their lives and see how they develop in time. I narrowed it down basically to Johannesburg here. So I really have no idea what you're asking me or where to start looking, really, because there's just so much. And if you aren't sure what you're looking for, you just have to dig about until something reveals itself. I suppose if you're paying attention and you are looking, you see. The final character is German Jewess Stella Goldschlag from the play Blonde Poison, written by Gail Lowe, and is based on the life of Stella, the German Jewish Greifer or catcher, a Nazi spy, where she was extraordinarily successful at her task of shopping Jews to the Gestapo. Her character is multifaceted and duplicitous and shifts from tortured victim to cruel killer, from loving daughter to betrayer, from gentle lover to depraved promiscuity. She was given the name... Yes?
Fiona, you need to be moving towards rounding up.
Okay. She was given the name Blonde Poison by the Gestapo, who reveled in her wretchedness. I will give you 1 or 2 lines of Stella, and then I will wrap up. 50-year-olds don't have teeth as good as mine. No, the dentist said, when was it now? He said last week, Wednesday, he said, Stella, your teeth are wunderbar. Wunderbar, that's what he said. I've looked after myself. I mean, I'm still beautiful. It's hard to believe that I'm 70, huh? Well, 71 actually, but who's counting? So some of the issues that I will discuss in playing the character, where to end and where does the character begin? Is there an infinite end or a merging or a fusion? And I hope my research will shed light on my pedagogy to help define what aspects of performer actor need to be adapted to include in a revised curriculum as part of the decolonizing process and advanced learning across cultures and multiculturalism. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Fiona. I really enjoyed the performance there. Of course, I do have a relationship with the work in one way or the other. And I hadn't really had the opportunity to see you playing the animation of that part of the presentation, which I enjoyed very much. So I hope this discussion has really, or this presentation has really sparked a lot of insights into what you've been sharing with us, and we shall discuss that much later in the process. And I would like to move on to the next presenter, who is again my dear colleague, Khafela Wamahohodi. We are together in the Department of Theatre and Performance. Khafela Wamahohodi is a writer, a musician, a playwright, a stage director, and he also teaches these courses in the department. And of course, a band leader for spoken word and music outfit, Marabele. He teaches creative writing, directing at the Wits School of Arts within the Department of Theatre and Performance. And Wamahohodi has written and directed numerous theatrical productions, including the just ended Shilaya Vole at the Soweto Theatre. He has also written a book of Revelations and Makura, amongst several others that he's working on. And the title of this presentation is Hoha Haula, Playmaking and Poetics of Ritual. Without much further ado, let me give this opportunity to Khafela to make a presentation on this topic. Over to you, Khafela, dear colleague.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. And yeah, Fiona is absolutely correct. This stuff is frightening. I flow better without the page, but anyway, let me read what I've written. Hohahaula, playmaking and poetics of ritual. So this is the topic I came up with, and I hope as I go, it will explain itself. Now, I see this as an occasion to sample notes imagined from my study, a creative writing project accompanied by a dissertation. I invite you to reflect with me about ways of making play to create a scaffold upon which the spiritual and the political can be held. How does playmaking construct rituals that fashion occasions of the future? Those who appreciate mythology as a site for truth-claiming might find it easier to participate. Some of you can already see how playmaking and the theater of bone throwing or the drama of divination are similar in character. Questions about artistic expression as a tool of social projection occupy my creative universe. The deeper I dig into my creative impulses, moments of extensive rationality are often dethroned by a preoccupation with questions about the spirituality of artistic expression. The term "kgokgakgaola" journeys into the insurrectory character of ritual drama. It is a metaphor for the meeting of playmaking and spiritual practice. The phrase takes root from the name of a plant which Botswana called mogaga. The power of mogaga plant is activated through acts of performance practice with different modalities and objectives by shamans, herbalists, and artists. Kgokgakgaola refers to the process of triggering mogaga. In my world, kgokgakgaola, or anticipatory dance drama, applies to the purging of domination and abolition of botheration. I'm convinced artistically, aesthetically, experientially, of the connection between ritual performance and dramaturgy. Precursors like H.I.E. Dlomo, Mudzunga Dabula, Barbara Entier, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Joe de Graft have written eloquently about the transfer of aesthetic principles from ritual performances to playmaking practices. I am pensive about how the performance of ritual drama is harnessed in what Fanon terms the zone of occult instability, where the dispossessed wage battle. I'm enchanted by the exploration of playmaking as a force of renewal. Kgokgakgaola. The question which looms large in this creative project is, how does ritual drama work as a mobilizing tool to capture power? The dissertation topic, Kgokgakgaola, Playmaking and Poetics of Ritual, reflect my curiosity about the time-honored practice where rituals and dance dramas work as portals of metaphysical worlds. In making Chila Haibulai, I explore ways in which the sound of music, the recital of charms, and the creation of gestures have muscles to dismantle the forces of disablement. Writing and directing Chila Haibulai has set me off on a journey which I did not anticipate. I aimed to write a play, not a literary drama. The writing on the page is only a guide to the play. My process therefore required that I constantly test the script for its theatricality or playability. Developing the play availed opportunities of writing and rewriting through bodies of thespians who played with me. The journey into the play began from a song, Sprakating, which I built from a traditional fable about Phokojwe Limja, the jackal and the dog. Fere bogologolo tala re le mantshana se se mo inong dinageng. Mtjale Phokojwe di sambentse re shebelana ka marapo le mateng. E le target di koko tsa maburu di lahlile. Re nanabela ko re phuntseng teng. Kunkwa batla go jewa tlama rona bo Phokojwe re berekela maleng. Re kile ra wela kolobeng tsa maoto mabedi. A ska re di re samile di reteng. Ra sutla dipareng re kgoboga dijabana re sa bolo go gata magaleng. Me re melatlhwa re tlhagola re jala me re me jewa Kolusila beleng, rele mogo, le nonyane tsa pula bo magwele, rele strong momoe. Mara once upon a time, le nyora le legolo, la poka mo sekgweng, magalapa a omile, no ka di khadile, e shele naga e le sheleng, fele mpja a re romanna ko bathong ke kope metsi teng. A e sa le Phokojwe le tile le shekere. Le tlhodia le nyora magalapeng le dibatana tsa metsi kubule kwena thothisi yo ko banwang teng ditlhare di tlhotlhorega madi ba a omile lefatshe le le manga megobeng di gwaide selo sa dikgwa sa wela sa le bakong ko e supileng teng a kgarakgatsega phokopša re kgotsamtsamme o swetse mo tseleng a re kgotsa ko o teng tsela dithaile o wetse mo pitseng o feletseng peng ya re tsela e budula kgaola naga phokopša kgarakgatsega kgatlhathule mpša ga bo motho a thuma mafureng spetšetše lethekeng monwana mo jemeng a ikutlwa bokhothane ka diketane molaleng ba re bophokopša makanyane re gana go golegwa fele re golegelwa eng ba ratile gore bo fa maleme mara re ralala fela fele re strong sprakating. So the song goes on. Usually it's call and response. Yeah, but just to cut it short and summarize, the long-standing friendship is torn apart when Mda trades his independence for a backing gig. Phokopše, on the other hand, refuses the chains which come with the changing world which is created by Motho. Phokopše is the alter ego through which I rebel against the horrors of Africa's neocolonial regimes. Thematically, I wanted to explore the meaning of freedom. Aesthetically, I set out to collapse the boundaries between storytelling and song, to dissolve the borders between poetry, hip-hop, and narration. Through Sprakating and other songs, some of which feed into Chila Haibulai, I'm discovering and recasting the freedom of the ancient creative who works outside the prison of form. After each performance, the characters which people Sprakating followed me through many conversations with audiences and my own introspection. And during one of these meditations, a scene popped out of the unconscious onto the page. And the following day, I tested the scene with actors during a live performance with my band Marabele. The temptation to expand this exploration was an organic response to these characters. Chila Haibulai became the world through which these characters were taking shape, in which these characters were taking shape, could play out and be fully realized. While the exploration began with Phokopše Limcha, Phiri and Katsi grew larger at the center of the story. The latest installment of the play at Funda Center builds from an annual ritual of rewriting, rehearsing, and replaying before live audiences. But can a play really anticipate? Can a play really anticipate? You may ask, as I did. Barbara Entier, founder of the Harlem's National Black Theatre, coined the concept of technologies of soul in 1968. Drawing on her interaction with Yoruba culture, she created ritualistic theater art that flows from the heart. Perhaps the concept of technologies of the soul is manifest in these stories. Once upon a time in Kampala, renowned poet Okot Bidek was appointed director of the National Theatre. This is post-independence Uganda. However, Bidek was annoyed by the lingering ghost of the colonial order. The British Council was housed in the building of the Ugandan National Theatre. Bidek initiated a ritual of exorcism. He devised the ritual play starring an army of 30 drummers. Bidek explained, one of the ways we chased the fellows out was to get 30 drums and start drumming from 8 o'clock until lunchtime. And the fellows in the office upstairs could not do any work. And then we would start again at 2 until 4. And then we would have a meeting with them. Bidek's ritual of evicting the British Council affirms the power of playmaking. It also illustrates the force of sound. He did away with long erudite speeches, opting for the noise of African drums that colonialism had suppressed. Noise resurfaces as it is let loose on the ears and psyche of British officials. Not only does Bidek display appreciation for the art of the Sangoma, his action expresses a hip-hop attitude. Bring the noise, or in Kwaito we say, Sikiyangengo, right? So the ritual of dialing up the noise of Ingoma to dismantle the master's house with natives, with tools that are native, I would call it Hochachauda. Muhammad Ali is known for a ritual of reciting rhymes before he fights, right? I think theater or boxing is theater to me. Ali's Rituals was a form of theater shot through what Lomo terms the voice of presentment. They all fall in the round I call, said Muhammad Ali. Outside the boxing ring, Ali wrote rhymes, comedy skits, and spoken word theater pieces through which he dramatized the fall of his challengers. Ali's performances in and outside the boxing ring are a form of khakhaula. He had an ability to picture and capture fights before it happened, successfully predicting the outcomes of 12 out of 13 bouts out of this poesy. I think, yeah, it's 13 out of 5. You can check it. Muboni and Siboni are storytellers created by Muchabe Mufokeng in Tsinkatana, a 1952 play script written in Sesotho. In their narration, the past, the future, and the present dissolve. Maubani kajenu le husasa, wahola monua hali isaho, kerona bari tezanga warula nako dikutwana, nako kinako eshe shamfela, e pathaleti. Time is a fast-moving stream which cannot be broken into fragments, they say. The two characters have an omniscient presence in the story they are telling. Together they are called Diboni, and those who foresee, those who see deeply. Muboni and Siboni narrate the story of Senkatana, who, with the aid of his mother, Madi Taulani, frees the people from the belly of Kodumodumo, a terrible monster who has swallowed an entire people and their treasures whole. Senkatana, the people's hero, becomes Moe, the ruler of the people in the new dawn. But Senkatana must soon face the biggest battle of his life, the invisible Kodumodumo of greed that has settled within the people's hearts. Fashioned in the fires of anti-colonial upheavals, Mufokeng's play imagines freedom from the Kodumodumo of colonialism, as was precipitated by the independence of Ghana in 1957. Written 5 years before Nkuruma's Ghana, Senkatana also appears to anticipate the neo-colonial pathologies which seek to arrest the full flowering of the freedom imagined. His play reads like
3 minutes, Kapela.
Yeah,
3 minutes,
done.
so you need to move towards. Okay, great.
Okay. Written 5 years before Nkuruma's Ghana, Senkatana also appears to anticipate the neo-colonial pathologies which seek to arrest the full flowering of the freedom imagined. His play reads like a foretelling of fates which befall dreamers like Nkuruma, Lumumba, and Sankara. I question if the play, as carried through the revelation of the two storytellers, Muboni and Siboni, divulges the playwright's own sense of foresight. Mufokeng, in asserting the revelatory power of his storytellers, points us towards the psychic elements of his own artistry. The acts of foreseeing and foretelling arguably are also acts of interfacing with the future, and through your vision, giving shape to what is immanent. By extension, the recent addition to the play, to the Haibolai, is a song, Adibaje, chanted by Piri and Pokobje, leading an army of Dilotsanaga to eat up a world fashioned by Motu. Adibaje, dibalo, adibaje, dibalo me, Dilotsanaga dibaweleka meno dibaje, dibalo, dibapupure dibaje, dibalo me. So this song plays on the idea that the poor will have nothing to eat, but that the poor will have nothing left to eat but the rich. This is the soundtrack of purgation. As Sandra suggests, mythology has limited potential. It provides a magic world that makes things possible. Yeah, this is what I have to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Khafela. You had 30 seconds to spare, so we will consider that as a gift that we're going to use at the end of the session. So thank you so much. And as a comment that I made previously, the performance was great, so was the paper, but more of that when we engage into what you guys were sharing. And I would like to move on to introduce the next speaker. And our next speaker is Lucas Pater, who is a lecturer in the Department of Multimedia at the University of Johannesburg. a position he has held full-time since 2014 and part-time since 2003. In addition to his academic work, Lucas has freelanced and collaborated with several creatives as an animator and designer, working in the fields of theater, dance, and broadcast media. The title of his presentation is Animated Documentary and World Building. Over to you, Lucas. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. All right, I'm going to jump to it. A lot of ground to cover, so let me share screen and let's begin. All right, so the title of my talk is Animated Documentary and World Building. I'm going to begin with an introduction to the field. I'm going to keep it quite brief, but I do feel it's necessary just to contextualize the work that I'm going to be doing. When first confronted, sorry, I just got to move this window. When first confronted with the term animated documentary, one may be struck by what appears to be its inherent contradiction. How can animation, which comes into existence through a process of construction and manipulation, act as a legitimate medium for documentary, a genre of filmmaking whose legitimacy is based on its evidentiary indexical live action footage of the real world? Sorry, I'm just starting my timer there. The indexical quality of live action footage refers to the trace that the footage carries of the thing it has recorded, a literal imprint of the events as they took place in our physical world. Even though we know that live action footage can be misleading, especially in this age of seamless digital manipulation, it is still the best means of showing things as they took place in what Bill Nichols refers to as the historical world. This indexical quality of live action footage leads to a common assumption that only it can act as a suitable medium for documentary, and that it is the only medium that shows us the world as it was and as it is. Theorists and practitioners of animated documentary refute this belief, while some argue that the ability to mislead with and manipulate live action footage renders it less trustworthy than we might imagine it to be. Others have avoided this argument altogether and have rather identified the things that animation can offer documentary that live action cannot. This line of thinking does not deny that live action occupies a key position in representing the real world, but sees animation as a valuable addition to the language of documentary. Contrary to what still appears to be a commonly held assumption, documentaries are not just a presentation of facts, but rather, as defined by John Grierson, the creative treatment of actuality. While a documentary film may present verifiable facts about events that occurred in our world, documentary films are often better understood as the presentation of an argument or a point of view, rather than an exposition of a fixed objective truth. Bill Nichols' schema of 6 modes within which documentary operates demonstrates the variety of approaches that a filmmaker can take in representing the historical world, from the authoritative to the more openly subjective. Considering these various modes, it becomes apparent that there are a number of interpretations of the role of documentary, and that its use of live action footage that does not necessarily guarantee or even intend an objective factual representation of our world. Seen in this way, documentary becomes a genre in which animation has an important role to play in depicting the events of our world. The overlap of animation and documentary is not new. One of the earliest instances of this hybrid genre can be seen in Winsor McCay's 1918 film, The Sinking of the Lusitania, depicting the torpedoing of the British vessel by the German Navy during the First World War. The film was based on eyewitness accounts and was made using realistic drawn animation, done in the style of a newsreel of that time period. While we often associate animation with entertainment, its ability to simplify information and clarify complex processes led to its adoption from the early 1900s as an educational medium. As noted by Mihaela Mihailova, there are several examples of non-fiction films during the silent film era, roughly from 1895 till 1928, in both the US and the Soviet Union, that utilized animated maps and animated sequences of industrial, agrarian, medical, and scientific processes. This ability of animation to clarify and simplify information led to its adoption during World War II by the US military for both informative and propagandistic purposes. We see this dual function of animation in Frank Capra's Why We Fight series, produced from 1942 to 1945. In the late 70s, Aardman Studios used spontaneous and unscripted audio field recordings as the basis for their animated conversation series, combining the indexical quality of these recordings with stop frame play puppet animation. The studio later used the variation of this technique in their well-known Creature Comfort series. In the early 2000s, there was a renewed interest in animated documentary with the release of 2 feature-length films, Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis in 2007 and Ari Folmer's Waltz with Bashir in 2008. Both films depicted personal narratives in the context of broader geopolitical events. Their success led to a proliferation of new animated documentaries and the widespread acceptance and popularity of the medium. In order to better understand what animation contributes to documentary film, Annabel Honus-Rose identified 3 key ways in which animation operates in a documentary context. She has termed these as mimetic substitution, non-mimetic substitution, and evocation. Mimetic substitution. In this mode, animation attempts to naturalistically mimic the physical world. It does this in order to depict events that occurred in a time or place where filming them in live action was difficult or impossible. In the BBC series Walking with Dinosaurs, filmmakers attempted a photorealistic recreation of the prehistoric world derived from fossil data. The series did this using the standard format of a nature documentary. Dinosaurs are shown as if filmed on location, with many shots mimicking handheld camera footage with shallow depth of field. This is a recognition of the fact that many viewers associate documentary veracity not just with live action footage, but with that footage packaged into a specific documentary format. Non-mimetic substitution. Here, the animation does not attempt to mimic the real world. Instead, animated forms are used to convey an extra layer of information that live action footage cannot. The animation functions in a symbolic way, acting as a signifier that tells us something about the subject of the documentary through its visual design and motion. This is very often done in tandem with live audio recordings, so that the audience experiences a juxtaposition between the indexical recording and the animated visuals. It's Like That is a film based around interviews with children detained in an Australian migrant center. The animated forms, which depict the children as small knitted birds, highlight their vulnerability and the feeling of being isolated and trapped. The animation adds a layer of symbolic meaning to the narrative while staying grounded in reality through the use of the children's voices. And finally, evocation. This mode is different to the first 2 in that the animation does not seek to represent an external reality, but an internal one, giving form to emotions, perceptions, and psychological states. An excellent example of this is Chris Landreth's Ryan. The film employs a 3D aesthetic that Landreth calls psychorealism, where photorealistic modeling is filtered through wild stylistic exaggerations and distortions. Now onto my practice. Over the past 6 years, I've been engaged in a practice-led research process, which has entailed the creation of a 33-minute animated documentary on the personal narratives of Polish refugees who emigrated in 1982 during the period of martial law imposed by the communist government and the crackdown on members of the Solidarity Workers Union. My interest in this topic stemmed from my father's involvement in Solidarity during that time, leading to his internment and exile. My family's journey first took us to a refugee camp in West Germany, in reality a pensionat for retired folk, with several other Polish families. While my own recollections of this period are scant, I was only 4 years old during our stay there. I grew up hearing many stories about that time, and what were often humorous recollections of the Poles' interactions with the Germans and their adjustment to life in the West. I had initially intended to contact several of the people who'd stayed at the camp, particularly those that had been there as children, and compile a narrative based on their stories. As it turned out, I was only able to contact one family friend, Piotr Strzelec, that was willing to take part in the project. This necessitated a shift in my approach, which led to the film becoming the story of 2 families, my own and the Strzelec family, whose stories are in parallel during that time. The film's narrative has been pieced together from extensive interviews that I conducted with my immediate family and with Piotr Strzelec. The audio recordings of these interviews form the basis of the film's audio track and provide its indexical grounding. The interviewees, along with other key figures that appeared in their recollections, are depicted as cartoon avatars throughout the film. So on the right, we see photographs of the key protagonist, and on the right is the cartoon avatar. I'm getting a little bit of interference from someone's microphone. Can we remedy that? The information given in the interviews has been supplemented by archival materials, arrest warrants, ID and travel documents, photographs, newspaper articles, postcards, and various paraphernalia and family heirlooms, which were incorporated directly into the film's sonography. So this is my father's coat that he was arrested in. This is a copy of an arrest warrant on the bottom right. And on the top left, we have an ID document from the the Solidarity Union. While the interviews, archival materials, and family heirlooms directly grounded the film in the historical world, all other aspects of its visual design, as well as substantial portions of its audio design, were carefully considered to reflect the historical world, whether through direct mimesis or in the form of a stylistic homage and visual puns. For instance, the modeling of the children that appear in the film differs substantially from that of the adults and is based on Bolek i Lolek, a much-loved cartoon from 1970s Polish television. On the left is a screen capture from the cartoon, on the right is one of the character designs from my film. Here we see a graphic depiction of General Jaruzelski, the architect of the military coup that saw the imposition of martial law, and based on the historical reference on the right from a sort of very famous television address that he gave to the nation when martial law was first declared. Well, the film is replete with images and symbols that can be decoded by an audience familiar with the time and place in which it's set. My intention was to simultaneously create a intangible world with particular texture. Thank you. Irrespective of their historical knowledge, might enter and inhabit. The process of creating a believable yet almost entirely manufactured world has led me to consider the notion of world building as a way to frame my practice and perhaps gain new insights into how animation can function in a documentary capacity. World building is a term that has entered the lexicon of academic discourse in recent years, and one I've been hearing with increased frequency. In her introduction to world building, transmedia fans industries, an anthology of academic writing on the subject, Marta Boni describes it as a transmedia and cross-media phenomenon. Fictional worlds created to find expression across many media and encompassing a multitude of narratives. They are perennial, collectively built semiotic realms. My own conception of world building has some overlaps with this definition, but also differs from it in key aspects. While I find the notion of the created world as a perennial semiotic realm highly evocative and one that resonates with my practice, its transmedia dimension is not relevant to my study, as I'm only concerned with the creation of a world within a clearly delineated single artifact. This definition aligns more closely with Karen Redrobe's discussion of a cinematic world and animation's relationship to it in her essay, The Worries of the World, Cartoons and Cinema. During the course of the production of my film, I increasingly felt that what I was doing was indeed building a world, a constructed world, transparent in its construction, reflecting the historical world. This constructed world became the means to speak about the historical world and the historical narrative, but never allowing the former to be confused with the latter, thus maintaining the film's documentary integrity. Part of the process of arriving at the notion of world building as a key to my practice was the amount of time and effort that I found myself dedicating to the creation of background art and environments, and the amount of screen time where these became the dominant elements of conveying the narrative. As a story about migration, Polonia requires the recreation of several locales based on historical references. I believe that the accuracy of the depiction adds to the film's historical authenticity, while the transparently constructed nature of the world allows for symbolic and fantastical elements to be introduced without losing this sense of authenticity. So at the top there, we see reference images that I shot in my hometown of Lubin, where we lived at the time of the imposition of martial law, and below is a landscape created for the film based on those references. Here is an interior of a police station. And at the top, we see from a postcard of Bad Zoden, the pensionat we stayed at in Germany, two screen captures of the postcard. And below that, we see how that was adapted to environments for animation in the film. As the narrative of the film takes place against the backdrop of the geopolitical conflict of the Cold War, political cartooning served as another influence in the creation of the world. It allowed for the introduction of spatial and temporal distortions within the constructed space, while maintaining a degree of documentary veracity, in that these visual tropes were clear references to political cartoons. This trope could then be expanded in the creation of fantastical scenes that communicated as visual metaphors, acting as a counterpoint to the voiceover narration of the recorded interviews, as we see in this sequence of images. This element of fantasy, grounded in historical reality, was extended to character design. The Military Council of National Defense, known by its acronym of WRON, which translates in Polish as the Crow, was the subject of many satirical cartoons in the underground press in Poland. In my film, it's depicted as a menacing spectre, assembled from various weapons and military medals. The numbering on its wings alludes to that found on the Polish military's tanks. In some instances, the environments took the form of rather obscure visual puns. Here we see a fairly accurate depiction of the Shillets family's new suburban home in Utah, placed within an environment modeled after the Crazy Cat cartoons that were popular in the USA in the first half of the 20th century, perhaps a gently humorous allusion to the frontier spirit of this emigre family. So this presentation has only briefly touched on some of the aspects of my practical work and my nascent attempt at a theoretical framework. Well, the notion of world building is one that I believe holds potential in this regard. It's still largely undeveloped and requires more reading, thought, and synthesis. And if there's time, I just want to play a very short clip from one of the scenes of the film.
Okay, and round up after that, please.
Nad ranem, ja pamiętam, obudziłem się, ja miałem pokój zaraz za drzwiami. Ja obudziłem się, jak tata już się z nimi kłócił za drzwiami. Już słyszałem głosy, że pamiętam, że się z nimi nie otworzył drzwi i się przekomarzał z nimi, a mi się zdaje, że przedłużał sprawę. Mama w międzyczasie wyrzucała dokumenty za balkonem, ale my byliśmy na parterze, oni już tam czekali i to wszystko złapali, te dokumenty, bo on był jakimś rzecznikiem prasowym bodajże województwa legnickiego, Solidarności. I tam jakieś dokumenty miał, a chyba też jakieś pieniądze trzymał ze składek. Oni pokazywali jakieś tam, przez tego Judasza pokazywali jakiś dokument nakazujący areszt czy coś takiego. I tata, pamiętam, mówił słowo, które nigdy nie słyszałem przedtem. Chyba powiedział, to jest falsyfikat. A oczywiście gliniarz powiedział, proszę pana, to nie jest żaden falsyfikat. Ja mówię, co to znaczy falsyfikat? Nie rozumiałem. Ja pamiętam tylko, że ja się bałem wyjść z pokoju.
Lucas, I'm not quite sure how long the film is going to be, but we seem to have run out of time. Is it possible to engage with the film as we've done with the previous one in another platform, as in sending to those who would like to engage with it? I think I would really appreciate in the interest of time.
Thank you, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Did you want to give a conclusive kind of summary or whatever? I want to give you that opportunity.
Thank you. No, I think the last statement I made, just about this being a very sort of early stage in my theoretical conception of how I want to frame this work, will suffice.
Okay, great. So that's it. So let me take this opportunity to thank Dominic Lucas Petter for this wonderful presentation. And like the previous one, it's really dominated by what he calls mimetic substitution, which is a form of performance or acting. And I really enjoy that. And of course, evocation that is mentioned. So thank you so much. I really enjoy, and I think I'd like to engage more with your animation much later after the process. So let me take this opportunity to introduce our fourth and last speaker on the program. And I'm happy we got some bit of time to speak at the end. And the fourth speaker is Shelley Berry. Shelley Berry, the name of the presentation is Creating Here. And I think there's been a YouTube link that we all can have access to, which is there at the end of the program. If you'd like to engage with that kind of work, that will be great. But a little bit more about the speaker. Shelley Berry is an award-winning filmmaker, including a SAFTA award for her contribution for film and television as a person with a disability. She was selected to be on the South Africa film delegation to MIPCOM, France, and the European Film Market, Berlin, the Raya Content Market, Brazil, Cannes, France, and the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. Her most recent work here, a virtual reality film, was selected for the Berlinale in 2020. And as I said before, the title is Creating Here. And we've got a bit of time here, and I'm going to give you the next 15 minutes to make a presentation on the topic Creating Here. Over to you, Shelley Berry.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to be sharing my screen with a PowerPoint presentation. So I will go ahead with sharing my screen now. I'm going to be speaking specifically about a chapter in my thesis about my virtual reality film Here. So let me just find my, share my screen. Okay. I have pre-recorded, so I will play the recordings. My first encounter with virtual reality was at a pop-up shop at 27 Boxes, Melville, Johannesburg, 2017. A man whose name I cannot recall hosted the pop-up shop with his wife, who later informed me that VR made her dizzy and nauseous, and she wished he was not as obsessed with it. They were selling VR experiences and cardboard viewers. The moment I put on the headset and the tiny pop-up shop transformed into a virtual world where I did not have a body was metamorphic. I recall slowly moving my wheelchair around to view the orb in which I had voluntarily inserted myself, slightly fearful that I would fall off the edge of an undiscovered earth. After an initial VR experience, the VR enthusiast looked upon my face filled with weightless wonder and announced, "Well, you may as well blow your mind." With these words, he introduced me to Google Tilt Brush, and within seconds, I was painting poetry in 3D and physically entering rushed experimental haikus. By the time I left that store with a cardboard camera on my lap, I knew I wanted to make VR. Bringing year into being. Electric South, an NGO promoting VR in Africa, put out a call for VR proposals later that year. Applicants were required to submit story ideas for an opportunity to be selected for this prestigious VR lab. At the time, I was living on the 28th floor in the Johannesburg CBD, and during the countless days of observing the city from the summit of a skyscraper, I considered what a transformed city would look like and imagined painting over a city in Google Tilt Brush, creating ramps and lifts and curb cuts. The impetus of this idea led me to thinking about artists with disabilities and wondering how they would transform a city through art. This premise set in motion the small beginnings of my VR film, eventually titled Here, 2019. A short film experiment that I did called Out of Reach is the precursor to Here, as I slowly evolved the concept, the seed of the story. I'd like to show you this short experimental piece. Bringing Year into being. Buck notes that VR technology has so far been mainly considered as a kind of new form of film, which goes one step further. You are no longer a disappearing invisible witness like in mainstream film, who is allowed to be everywhere in the world in order to understand what the film is about, but you are actually in the center of it. In Here, the viewer is placed in my body, seated in a wheelchair. It is not completely immersive in that the viewer is able to look down upon this body and therefore not necessarily feel that they are within that body. This distancing technique was not intentional, but rather as a result of a high camera rig attached to my wheelchair. It does, however, obliterate any sense of the viewer's own body in that world and is an invitation to what being in a wheelchair may feel like, as the angle of view is a seated one. Rubin references Heater, who uses the psychological term interoception to describe the awareness of bodily sensations. From observing viewers engaging with the experience of ear, many of them displayed discomfort or unease while seated in a wheelchair. Some participants were interested in the VR experience, but not in the act of sitting in a wheelchair. Many who ventured forth with the experience expressed relief when they stood up from the wheelchair, an act of leaving behind an experience that they were essentially uncomfortable with. The empathy machine. In a TED Talk in 2015, Chris Milk described VR as the ultimate empathy machine, allowing users to enter a world and empathize with the characters within that world. He refers to this real-life experience as truth, where experience are not simply watching through the proverbial cinematic window, but have in fact entered the room. Suzanne Keen counters Milk's reference to truth, noting that empathy in a VR world requires a shared experience by the experienced and the VR designer or author. While experienced empathy certainly is complex and not a single experience, or singular experience for viewers, there is mixed empirical evidence of VR enabling empathy significantly more than two-dimensional viewing, for example. A study at Stanford University looked at the building of long-term empathy, in this case for people who were homeless, using both traditional and VR viewing content. The conclusion of the study indicated that although VR seemed to provide experience with slightly more empathy than traditional viewing, after 8 weeks, there was not much difference in attitudes between the two groups of participants, although the VR users signed a petition to improve the lives of those who were homeless. The study therefore concludes that VR seemed more effective at improving attitudes towards specific social targets and motivating pro-social behaviors. The researchers, however, are clear to point out that the evidence of VR eliciting empathy is actually quite limited. A different study with 24 university students in Australia produced results which revealed greater indicators of empathy than two-dimensional environments. Empathy, as it relates to VR, is on the whole a new field of study and research, but results are certainly not conclusive to support Milk's argument of it being the empathy machine. Here, however, does not aim to evoke empathy. The problem with empathy as it relates to disability is that it circumvents a human rights framework of situating disability. This deters society from the need to advocate for equality as opposed to having an intimate experience in someone else's reality. In VR, one can so easily fall into the trap of wheelchair simulation, where experience can try a wheelchair on for size and realize some of the physical and attitudinal barriers faced by persons with disability. This is often used in classrooms or in the corporate world, where it is lauded as an experiential educational practice, providing learners with newly found empathy for persons living with disabilities. In one such study at Pennsylvania University and East Carolina University, a student made the following remark after the experience of a few hours in a wheelchair. I was a little nervous when I first got out of the chair, but I'm glad I did. It taught me to treat people with disabilities like normal people. Researchers at Stanford University refer to a different study which uses methods of blindfolding to simulate blindness. The results indicated that although there was some amount of empathetic concern, it ultimately led to reinforcing stereotypes about blindness. Personally, I do not see any particular value with this kind of simulation and believe that it patronizes the lives of persons living with disabilities. After all, human rights is not a simulation. Here is not beckoning for Milk's empathy machine Here is an act of witnessing the past by acknowledging the role played by activists fundamental to the liberation movement in South Africa, while unveiling a future that exists in animation as it is still so far from our current reality. Okay, I'm going to skip a few slides and that because of time. With the advent of VR as a new form of technology, an opportunity arises to shift the narrative. VR has far-ranging potential for persons with disabilities, and it's largely being used in a medical context and also for educational purposes. However, fictional narratives that are emerging in storylines are still perpetuating stereotypes where disability is being portrayed within hospital environments. The film Defrost 2015 takes place in the year 2045, when liquid nitrogen is commonly used to freeze patients until remedies for their illnesses are developed. The film shows the experience of Joan Garrison as she wakes up after a frozen state after 30 years, reuniting with her loved ones who have become, sadly, strangers. Another VR film, Catatonic, also produced in 2015 by another studio, describes the VR experience as follows. Strap yourself in and take a ride that's unlike anything you've experienced before. In this pioneering VR horror film, you step into the shoes of a mental health patient in a wheelchair who is being welcomed into a sinister psychiatric hospital. Both VR experiences frame the person with a disability as a victim of circumstance doomed to a life of misery in hospital. In contrast, the African film, The Other Dakar, made in Senegal, integrates persons with disabilities into the narrative as part of Senegalese society, placing a short-statured man as an inspiring lead that makes a speech about art. So perhaps, just perhaps, films like The Other Dakar and Here provide a significant counterfoil to films such as Catatonic and Defrost, whose narratives continue to other persons with disabilities as aberrations of the norm in society. And it may appear that Africa is veering into significant narrative shifts in fictional VR representation of persons with disabilities. In conclusion, there are millions of people with disabilities in this world. We exist. What are the implications of not showing bodies that are actually here on this planet, outside of a context of being pitied or needing to be taken care of or shown as tragic victims of circumstance or sites of ridicule? The exclusion of the participation of so many people affect the kind of stories that are being told and the way they are being told and by whom they're being told. This severely limits cinema, because ultimately viewers will experience a white heterosexual man's story from a white heterosexual man's point of view. And we have ingested that kind of cinema all our lives, not only in this country, but across the world, with the pervasive influence of Hollywood. Here is a call to action, a call to art, and therefore a call to cinema to create an inclusive visuality and imaginary. If we open up the screen to other bodies and other stories, we will have a much richer, diverse, complex, interesting cinema that is more representative and that reflects the world we actually live in. As Jessica Brilhart notes, we are the builders of worlds, the makers of storytellers. What an amazing concept. Thank you.
Is that it, Shadi?
Yes, Shelley.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all our four presenters. It was really great and humbling listening to the range of niche areas, ranging from acting, performance, to ritual, to film, documentary, all of them expressing different kinds of interesting areas of study. So I'm really blown off by the rigor and by the variations and variety of kind of research areas that all of you are exploring. And I'm sure our panelists will be giving us more information about that. So ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give this opportunity with these 15 minutes, exactly 15 minutes that we have, because I'm told we're supposed to be ending at 12 o'clock. It's a kind of respondent kind of feedback, but I don't like to take this opportunity to offer it as a muzzling exercise where those who have presented have no opportunity to respond to any of the comments that our panelists would have made. So if you feel the need to respond to any kind of feedback that you get from our panelists, that would be great. But first of all, the opportunities to the panelists that I've introduced. And if any of you who are listening would like to ask questions, maybe in the chat box or after the conversation, then that would be okay. I'm not quite sure who would like to start. If you can show me by a sonic or visual sign that would like to speak first, I'll be great. That'll be great, and I'll be able to pick you up. Who goes first? Manola. Oh, I see. Petro, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for all four presenters. And my response to you will be a spontaneous, perhaps reaching towards the creative. And this is what I'll give you today. For Fiona, give me a moment, let me find the notes. Fiona.
Is that a performance?
The challenge of researching my own work.
Thank you, Fiona. I was struck by how you very delicately switched to performance, to research conversation, to performance language. There's a magic there, and there's something important about that moment. Kafela. Dialing up the noise. Revelatory power. An army to eat up the world. I have a question for you. My observation is that the context in which the performance happens, the drums outside or in the building, and the other examples that you used, that very site. And I wondered, what is the site of the strongest performance for your own work? The choice of site. And here is a response for, let me just find your name. Dominic, thank you. Here is a response for Dominic. World building. World building for how we breathe, why we fight, walk with dinosaurs, or escape the crow. What world am I building? I was struck in this presentation by the techniques of distancing, again, that involvement of the personal story and the person of the researcher and the value that is there in the animation. Thank you so very much. And then for the last one, I was struck by how the work is really wanting to challenge binaries and reality, virtual reality. The phrase virtual reality itself encapsulates a binary. And these two binary statements in your work, as you presented it, struck me. And the first one is that's the very sentence you started with, and one of the final sentences. And the binary goes, I have pre-recorded bodies that are actually here. And the second one comes from somewhere in the middle. In this work that simulates blindness, personally, I do not see the value. Thank you. That is my response.
Thank you, Petro. I appreciate this. Just to remind everybody who is listening that there will be a plenary session at 3:15. If we have any burning issues that we cannot cover at this particular moment, there will be that opportunity to say whatever you want to say about the work that we have witnessed today, not just in this session, but many other sessions that have preceded this one and those that are to come. I see we've got 10 minutes to spare. I would like to move on to the other panelists, Margaret or Manola. Who goes next?
Yeah, if you like me to speak up, I can. Thank you very much.
Sure, go ahead, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. So I'm really highly impressed also by the density of all the presentations that you were giving and by the high relevance of all the research questions that you are formulating. So this is like a wrap up to all of you, because each of you has a very particular take on a personal experience, very dense artistic practice that you build on and that you incorporate into your artistic research. And that's how you really all create an episteme, a moment of an experience where we get a new knowledge. This is really for all the four I have seen now in very different takes. The whole thing was a transmedial experience, as it was also a term in the last presentation of Shelley, and also from Dominic before. As we have only a short time, I think I also will write a few sentences, but to go through in the order how you appeared, it was for me very impressive also with Fiona to think about these different roles that she was incorporating, and this really worked in a great way. Also, artistic research method can be a performative method and should show to us that in research we can also use the practices that we develop in arts in order to develop also a valid and usable sentence for academic research. And this was excellent when I experienced the different roles of Fiona. I would recommend also, for me, I would ask then also later on the panel, what is really the core research question? Was it playing a role outside of one's own culture? If so, yeah, that works. It's wonderful. I don't know where there are certain borders and certain moments in this core playing. So I really would like to go on to discuss and recommend also Richard Sennett with The Craftsman and Saskia Sassen. They both were pointing in cultural theory also to some moments of role play in order also to generate empathy for others. This leads me then to the next step where this chord playing. I was thinking also of Shu Li Chang's work as a reference. That is 3x3x9, where she also refers to incorporating a trial, a court, where people were accused for their sexual experiences or practices, from Casanova to present times, where people were put in prison. And she was showing it the last year's biennial in Venice. So she's and we were enacting also a court reading as a play, as a theater play. And so this is very interesting to bring the relevant social questions on the table. And Gafela was doing the same. As this was really super fantastic for me. I experienced this Jaula, I think if I pronounce it right, I don't know, but the playmaking I could experience also via the Zoom session, fantastic. I didn't have the mojoja plans, maybe this would have been more necessary in this participatory dance, but you coined one sentence, please note that the creative outside the prison of form, this is fantastic, you should make a paper out of it. And also the Uganda exorcism, when you were telling about the story of playing drums in office hours, this is really transgressing borders of cultures and being effective as really an agency tool. I could fully understand this, that this is a ritual like Muhammad Ali does. So you really make this future making on site. I was putting it in the chat. And yeah, this leads me a bit to the questions also to Dominic. Through the darkest of time, Papers, Please. These are games that also build on the experiences of former East Germany and having personal narrations in game cultures, as this is my field. Please take a look to these games. I'm sure you were doing it already, but I think that you could take up and mix also this transfer of different personal experiences into a useful play experience. And I think I said already to Shelley that also this inclusive dimension, blindfolding, having this wheelchair experience, this makes sense to this medium. This is a very good take on it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I do appreciate your feedback and absolutely agree with you with issues relating to novelty of the work. All the four works that I've listened to are treading on new ground. Absolutely new ground, you know, investigating how one plays a role from a different culture into another, and what we can learn from ritual in terms of performance, and what we can learn from evocation, you know, mimetic performance. Manola, it's really good to see you after a long time when you left Johannesburg. So over to you for the last comments of the panel.
Thank you. And I really want to thank Christo and Zanelli for inviting me to be present, to make responses and think and imagine alongside these panelists. So it's been a privilege to be here and to listen and sort of offer conversations back and reimaginings back, and just to kind of be present with you in this work. I think one of the things that really struck me in the presentations, and especially the first two, and then also then in the next two, was the role of sound and the sonic as knowing, but also as then the sonic is revelatory, both in the accents, the voices taken on, but in the orality as well. And that potential and the potency of that as a performative knowledge paradigm that I think is quite important to be explored in the work. I have written down here for Fiona, at that time, whose body if not mine? What relationship and value does my embodiment in craft have to South Africa's history and present? And I think underlying the research is really this question of this experience and where does it sit? And it's an important one, I think, to be answered, to speak back to multiple traditions of allyship, of presencing, to talk back a little bit to the question of decolonial. I would also think that looking at Yang and Tuck's work, which talks not about just discourse, but say redistribution of land. So in the context of performance and culture, is it discursive? Is it that moment of agency? But is there something around capital redistribution of other ways in which performance holds capital that needs to be considered to answer this question? I think these are other lenses to hold, or other paradigms to hold the work in. I'm struck really strongly between a really old argument in performance, which is around Arthur's interest in what's not been born yet, and Peggy Fallon's work around disappearance, and performance acting itself out. And somewhere in all of the work, what registers as this spectrum, the rainbow spectrum, is that it's a spectrum. It's not these many colors, but all these things that have been, these questions that have a moment now to present themselves. In Kofela's work, again, I think really that question about the orality, which opened up in my body remembrances of knowledge, but I was thinking about the mantra and how the mantra in the Indian context and what's sonically communicated and then transforms the other body and is then passed down as knowledge, but also as transformation. And what is that role in that paradigm in this work, which I think still is there to be held. In Lucas's work, I think they're kind of sitting with the indexical is a beginning, but I'm curious about where he might go, because it seems, I mean, the work is beautiful, it's powerful, it's theoretically it's bringing in, it's very rich, but I was curious about what other sort of meta-theoretical word or vocabulary might Lucas develop. There was something around the ocular sensory, for example, because there's the visual, but then again, there's the sonic. The Polish, the accent, which is again communicating history and knowledge, so many things in that sense. And what might you develop outside of the use or the terminology of indexical? How would you develop a vocabulary that sort of meta places what this work is doing? I think it would be interesting to see what the development of that concept would be. Finally, to Shelley's work, I watched the video yesterday, and I think there was some part and I was just like really just moving and dancing and laughing. And I was thinking about queer joy. And I was thinking about, the move away from empathy and sympathy and the move into possibility. And so instead of the disabled gaze, I think what happened for me is to wonder about the multiple ways in which my own disabilities need not be erased, but which can perform in joy. And I think what was opening up, and this came up in a DFL conference presentation last week, it's come up earlier in disability aesthetic work, is that what is the possibility, the aesthetic possibility of richness that's offered to the so-called able, make peace with our own disabilities. And that, in terms of both a sort of queer futuristic aesthetic joy, was very, very present in the work. And it comes back to all of this between the past and the future. Where are we sitting? I found all of the presentations extremely rich. I'm looking forward very much to the discussion in the afternoon. There are questions around the rigor that I think this work speaks back to, which, I mean, it's obvious that there's rigor, and I think the stepping into then not just rigor, but legibility, and how do we legibilize these particular nuances that becomes more important for both the South, for decolonial, for these very complex political histories with legibility as well. So, but I think that's a question to come back to later. And there's something around the density, and which I'll again come back to in the later presentation, and the possibility of the dense video essay, which we've discussed in other sessions before, as an alternative to the writing an essay. And I think that question of where does sonic and practice sit, where does theater's practice sit in relationship to language, is something that's being asked really also of these works. And that's a response I'd like to come back to in the afternoon presentation. But thank you for this moment of great joy and transformation that I've experienced over the last hour and a half. And it's been a privilege to be present.
Well, thank you, Manola. I appreciate your feedback. I've been given the referee's optional time to take any few comments from those who have presented, if you would like to respond to, what any of our panelists have said, you are free to do so. If we don't have, then we can have one quick question or comment from anybody who has got a burning issue that they want to share in my optional time, and then I will hand over to Christian. Looks like everything is fine. I can as well blow the whistle and say the game is over. Over to you, Christian. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate.
Samuel, thank you very much for your extremely deft chairing of the session, and to the panelists. Really enjoyed your takes on both the content of what was being presented by the 4 PhD candidates, and also your engagement and appreciation with what was being done, what was being emoted. So we're going to close this session now. I'm very aware it's time for lunch, and we'll meet again on the third Zoom link. Please make sure that you do click on that third Zoom link, and that'll be at 1:30 for our third and last session, which will be chaired by Manola, and will feature another 4 really interesting and challenging creative work PhD projects. So thanks everybody, and look forward to seeing you all again. And do remember the last session at 3:15, where we'll all come together to try and make some sense of what kind of patterns and tendencies are emerging from the work as a whole. So thanks a lot. Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the feedback. It was and the pointers and the references, very helpful. Thank you so much from Fiona.
Fiona, thank you. It was lovely.
Thank everybody. It was great to have you along. Cheers.
Thank you, Samuel.
Bye, Margaret.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.